All right, I think we're ready to begin. I want to welcome everybody to this week's Impact Hour. We're excited to have you all here on this cold Austin day. Good thing we're all inside. Uh, Today's topic is sowing the seeds of food justice. And we are really excited about this Impact Hour because this was an idea that our students brought to us. And we've been working on it for several months now. And fortunately, because of these two student leaders, we're able to bring this information to you here today. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Luna. I oversee the Career Services Center. And we do these impacts hours every Thursday at 1 o'clock. Our student speakers today are Catherine Suture. And Catherine is in her final semester of the MSSW program. And she's also a Grace Scholar and a Bridge Scholar. Previously, she worked for Island Press, which was a nonprofit environmental book publisher in Washington, D.C. And it's always awesome to have a good social worker with excellent writing skills. So putting a plug for any employers that may be hiring in May. After graduation, Catherine plans to work with children or young adults with autism or other neurodevelopmental disabilities. And she also seeks to integrate environmental justice and ecotherapy into her practice. Benji Habito received his undergraduate degree from psychology from Boston College, and he's also in his final semester of the MSSW program. Benji grew up in Dallas and has spent a majority of his time outdoors, working in summer camps as a teenager and also doing wilderness therapy. Currently, he's interning at the Settlement Home, a residential treatment center for girls in foster care, and eventually hopes to finish up our program, get the LMSW, and then we'll be seeking his clinical license to do clinical practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Benji and Catherine to start our program.
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction. It's good to see everybody here. I will go ahead and share my screen and then we will get going. Let me see if I can do that really quickly. All right, here we go. So welcome everybody to this week's Impact Hour, which is titled Sowing the Seeds of Food Justice. And we are joined, apart from my co-host Catherine, by the panelists Max Elliott, Roberto Araiza, and Aswini Sivaswamy. And we're going to get more into our panelists' biographies and their current strivings in a moment. So I would like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. And for those of you that have not participated in a land acknowledgement before, it is something that is prepared by the UT Center for Native American Indigenous Studies. And what they say is that as the flagship institution in our state university system, it is important that the University of Texas at Austin demonstrate respect for the historic and contemporary presence of Indigenous peoples in Texas, and particularly in the greater Austin area. To that end, it is incumbent upon the University of Texas at Austin to recognize that our campus resides on what were historically the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who were dispossessed of their homelands. Land acknowledgements are an expression of gratitude and appreciation to the Indigenous peoples, the traditional caretakers of the land, for the use of their lands on which we work, study, and learn. And with that, I will begin the land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo, Come Crudo, Coahuitecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and the territories in Texas. And in the spirit of respect for those that have cared for these lands, we encourage all of you to open public events and gatherings with such land acknowledgements if you feel so inspired. And with that, I will hand it over to Catherine to talk a little bit about sort of our club, which is EJET.
Hey, sorry, I don't know if you cast me off. I got totally booted off, but jumped back on my phone hotspot. So sorry if I missed that. I just pinged back in. Are you ready for the EJET intro?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So apologies, everybody. But we are EJET, the Environmental Justice and Ecotherapy Organization. And we were founded by students from the Steve Hicks School of Social Work last year. Benji and I are two of the four current officers, kind of the second crop of student leaders of the group. And we sponsor speaker events and workshops like this one. And just a quick plug that our next one is going to be on Friday, March 5th at 1 o'clock. And that's going to be in collaboration with the Office of Professional Development. So CEUs will be available. And that's titled Environmental Justice and Racial Equity with Carmen Llanes Pulido, who is with GAVA, Go Austin, Vamos Austin. We also share content related resources with our members on our listserv, which you can join at the link below, and our Facebook. And we are in the process of applying for funding through the Green Fund with the Office of Sustainability. And as Benji and I are graduating, we are seeking 2 new officers to come and join the team starting at the end of this semester. So if you are interested, please send a note to our listserv.
Thank you, Catherine. And with that, we will jump right into some definitions that we have for you guys. So our discussion today is really centered upon both food justice and environmental justice. And so first we had a poll that I believe you all saw at the beginning. Would this be a good time to share the poll? Yes, here we go. So now you can take a moment to look at the results in terms of how people feel in terms of confidence defining these terms. And it looks like overall people attending this talk are relatively confident in their abilities to define food and environmental justice. So we won't have to dive too deeply into that. And I'm sure a lot of that has to do with this being a self-selecting group. If you are interested in a presentation like this to take time out in a weekday, I'm sure you already have some idea of what's going on, but there are some people that put neither disagree or disagree. So I think that some preliminary definitions will sort of contextualize the rest of the speech for everyone. So what I have here for the definition for food justice is a grassroots movement driven by the belief that by transforming our food practices, we can live healthier, more authentic lives while supporting positive social and environmental change. And that low-income communities and communities of color are all too absent from the dominant food narrative and are disproportionately harmed by the current food system, along with a commitment to uprooting injustice in the systems of food production and distribution. And next we have some definitions for environmental justice. The first one is given by the EPA, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with the respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And then another definition given by Green Action, which is an NGO, an intergenerational, multiracial, and international movement that promotes environmental economic, and social justice by recognizing the direct link between economic, environmental, and health issues, and demanding a safe, clean community and workplace environment. And so, holding the general idea of these definitions in mind, we will now move into getting to know our panelists, beginning with Max.
Yeah, just to quickly introduce Max, who is an LMSW and graduate of this program at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work. He is co-founder and former executive director of Urban Roots, which seeks to create empowering opportunities for young adults to be catalysts for change in their community by growing produce on an almost 4-acre farm over in East Austin. He's a founding member of the City of Austin Food Policy Board and serves on the board of New Philanthropists. And I would invite Max to just jump in here and share a little bit with us about how food justice and environmental justice has played a role in his career as a social worker.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation. It feels good to be a part of this conversation, and I'm really glad that I can bring some of my friends and colleagues in on this conversation too. I didn't grow up farming. I think that was my first entry point into agriculture, but I didn't grow up that way. And so I want to bring in my mentors and role models who helped give me a chance to learn where food comes from. Liz Maines from Colorado, Earl Antoine in New Orleans, Tom Dana from Mississippi. Here in Central Texas, Marisol Valle and David Petrie from Tecolote Farm. I just owe a lot to people that I worked with who really taught me how to grow food. I think when I was young, I was really interested in politics and I was interested in being a teacher. And I was, like a lot of young people in their 20s, feeling really restless, had a lot of anxiety, and was, as a teacher, loving teaching, but not feeling connected to being in the classroom. And so I found myself on a farm that was an education farm, and found that farming gave me a chance to really feel rooted, feel grounded, gave me a chance to feel a part of a community, and it gave me a sense of purpose. And after that, I just was really hungry to get a lot of different experience and exposure, not only on working farms, but also in cities and communities. So volunteering with Edible Schoolyard in Berkeley, ended up working at Austin Community Gardens here in Austin, and then making my way back to New Orleans, where I went to college, and doing a lot of work with community gardens. Parkway Partners was the name of this organization, and they were providing plants and seeds and really setting up residents in isolated neighborhoods where there were no grocery stores. I was working with young people who had gardens that were adjacent to public housing, growing food for how they defined it was the sick and shut-ins. And I really learned the power of what it's like to really see food justice in the work. So residents coming together to grow food, to distribute, to support, to nourish residents in their neighborhoods. And so that's kind of how it evolved. And when I was working in New Orleans, teaching people how to grow food it felt really easy. Growing food was really easy. The hard part was doing the thoughtful community engagement, was really trying to build the leadership development and really battle kind of the institutionalized food injustice. And so that's actually what inspired me to want to go to social work school, because I felt like, well, I know how to grow food. I don't know how to do this macro and meso social work. And eventually, I became, worked on farms for a number of years, but I got to a point where I wasn't the mechanic, the carpenter, the plumber, the welder that you need to be a for-profit farmer. I have so much respect for growers, but I wanted to be able to use those skills to integrate that with my passion of growing food and kind of use my teaching skills. And so I started talking about creating a youth development farm program. And so talking about it long enough got enough people excited, and we created Urban Roots. And one of the things I think that is kind of relevant is that one of the workshops that we would do at Urban Roots was we would talk about the difference between charity and social change. And I think in the food system, that's really important when you think about our emergency food relief systems. I mean, thank goodness we have emergency food relief like food banks and soup kitchens. But the interesting thing is that we will never solve hunger with food. And that sounds pretty far out to really take in. But there is more than enough food to feed everybody in the world and then some, but there's still institutionalized hunger. And so when we're thinking about food justice, we need to think about social change. We need to think about changing the institutionalized systems that keep people from being nourished. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. But yeah, that's kind of where I came from.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. And you kind of already explained that you have this kind of blend of micro and macro social work practice. And I'm hoping that when we go into these applied definitions of food justice, kind of taking them from the theoretical to what it actually looks like, you could address how food justice relates to social work at both the micro and macro levels.
For sure. So when you're talking about food justice, you have to talk about slavery. You have to talk about sharecropping. You have to talk about the systems of oppression that really our country is founded upon. And because we're still operating from this brutal legacy, and it really shapes our current food system. From the big picture perspective, from policy, that goes back hundreds of years, where our federal government was really trying to make sure that all residents have access to affordable and abundant food supplies. And so they're trying to support growers in the biggest sense. And ultimately what that means is they're trying to encourage growers to get bigger. And in the 70s, that was the actual motto: get big or get out. The interesting thing about the USDA, it has so much power, and it shapes a lot of not only the landscape but the economy of agriculture. Health and Human Services is underneath the USDA, and so when we try to get these real dietary recommendations from the Health and Human Services, you're not going to get true healthy recommendations if they're going to counter what's best for growers, what's best for farmers. And so that's why if you compare us to other countries, you might see recommendations. We might be eating more meat, we might be eating more dairy, we might be eating more sugar, because if we were too strict on those things, it would affect our agricultural economy. So that's on the big picture federal level. That really gets shaped at a pretty high level. At the local level, I think it's really exciting that we have a lot of food policy boards that are popping up all over the country, and Austin's really lucky to have one. It's the Austin Food Policy Board is a conjunction with the City of Austin, with City Council and the boards of commission, the county commissioners, and we have a food policy manager that is in the City of Austin in the Office of Sustainability. And those folks can really have a lot of influence to direct resources, financial resources, to really support growers, restaurants, and really direct resources to increase food access as well. So that's just kind of on the policy level and the big picture. When I think about access to farming and resources, I came across a really interesting article in the New York Times a few weeks ago, talking about who's farming. And it is in the national, in the U.S., it's been predominantly white, and it is that much more so. In 1920, this article is talking about how African American farmers have left agriculture for different reasons. But in 1920, there were more than 925,000 black-run farms, about 14% of all U.S. farms. And in 2017, there are fewer than 35,000 black-run farms. So that's less than 2% of nation's farms. And so people left for lots of different reasons: the Great Migration, going up north for greater opportunities. But there's also been identified disparities in access to loans and resources. Actually, there was the largest class action lawsuit against the federal government was in 1996, Pigford versus Glickman. which documented discrimination against Black farmers. And so when it was settled, it was $1.2 billion to go towards Black farmers that had been discriminated against. However, because so many Black farmers had been discriminated and it took so long, a lot of people lost their farms, and it didn't really shift the tide to create more opportunities for Black growers. And that's horrible. It's heartbreaking, and it's as farming gets more mechanized, and land gets more expensive, it's harder and harder to bring more people to become growers. I want to acknowledge Tiffany Washington. She's a local African-American grower in East Austin. She's been doing a lot of great research about the history of Black farming in Central Texas, and is a really important advocate to talk about how the city can be directing more resources to support Black growers. When I think about labor, I mean, I think most people probably on this call know that farm labor is one of the most exploited labor forces in the U.S. and the most essential. They have to be around heavy machinery. It's hard physical work. A lot of them are around pesticide exposure, sun exposure. They don't have great sanitary facilities. Typically, they earn poverty level wages, and there's really no right to organize or no right for overtime. It's really tough to do agricultural farm work. When I think about food consumption, people have defined and described the way that America's food access is like food apartheid. A lot of the means for access is through the built environment, and that's kind of a public health perspective, and that means how a neighborhood has access to fresh local foods is not really decided by the neighbors. It's where grocery stores are installed. It's where restaurants are concentrated. A lot of underserved communities have concentrations of fast food restaurants and no grocery stores or farmers markets or community gardens. And so what are the ways that we can advocate for more equitable infrastructure to ensure that residents can have healthier lifestyles? That is huge. I can't say that enough. When I think about the environmental impact, traditional agriculture, and this kind of ties in with the environmental justice piece, air pollution. If anybody's ever been around a hog farm, you will remember that smell for the rest of your life. Cattle farms also, it's just the sewage, the way that, the U.S. concentrates the production of meat means that there is unsustainable concentration of waste. And so what do you do with that waste? And it gets into the air, it gets into the water, it gets into rivers, and it affects predominantly low-income communities, I think, that are adjacent to these farms, and also in the waterways and coastal communities. I think one of the interesting things when I think about food justice is how COVID has really given us a chance to really see this up front. And I think that when we're not in a pandemic and when everything's moving slowly, I think people can just forget, or a lot of people that don't have to think about the food inequities. But this COVID has really brought it to the surface in this really powerful way and given us a chance to really be creative, and hopefully we can do something about it long term and get that social justice piece. So thinking about how people in the food system are frontline workers, that's becoming now more evident than ever. When COVID first came out, you were hearing about people that were working in meat factories, meat processing facilities, who were getting COVID at more extreme rates because there's so many people working alongside each other. Grocery store employees are more exposed to people being in the front lines as well. So thinking about labor in COVID and how more people are at risk. Looking at emergency food relief. And I know people have seen the stories of cars lined up for miles waiting for food access. The Central Texas Food Bank, the demand has doubled since COVID. And part of that is because employment. You can't talk about food justice without talking about the economy and jobs, and that's really essential. AISD has really stepped in creative ways. I think during a normal summer, AISD serves about 250,000 meals a summer. This last summer, they served up to 750,000. And young people are not getting their meals in schools as they're, doing school from home. But AISD has been making meals available through kind of drive-through pickups. Monday through Thursday and Friday, they're providing meals for people to take through the weekend, which has been really creative. I've been really inspired to see how AISD has really stepped up to do that. In restaurants is something everybody is aware of. Many have shuttered, and a lot of employees have really been laid off as well. So I kind of just wanted to put those, kind of look at food justice applied, and so people can kind of get a sense for what that could look like nationally and locally. And now I'd really like to highlight a couple of examples that are touching on at least one or some elements of food justice. I'd love to bring in Sweeney Savaswamy into the conversation. Sweeney is a social entrepreneur. She's an engineer by training. She's a consultant. She's a founder and creator of Sessa Tea. And she's also on the leadership team of Good Works Austin. And I'm really inspired by what Good Works Austin is doing. And I'm hoping Sweeney can, tell us more about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. Thank you for having me. And most importantly, having Good Works Austin a part of this conversation. Wow, right? You landed a lot of facts and a lot of realities just now for us to hear. I think most of us are very well aware of everything that you just shared, but no matter how many times I hear this conversation or have this conversation, even if it's understood information, it still hits hard. So thank you for giving us that scope on that larger level, because it is, we have a lot of work to do, essentially. We can't let these pre-existing conditions continue, but to work on the changes we need. It's not an easy path, clearly. So my name is Sweeney. I'm an entrepreneur here in Austin, and Sessa Pure is a business that I founded and run, but I'm here mostly as a representative for Good Work Austin. So I serve on a volunteer leadership team for Good Work Austin. And to touch on it, the organization actually, it's a pretty young organization. It was founded in 2018 around this mission by business owners and operators coming together, fighting for higher bare minimum wage. And as of a year ago, early in 2020, the organization was still getting developed. We're still in the discussions, and we knew what we believed in. And when I say we, it was fellow independent business owners and operators coming together with this idea of that we wanted to do business better, and that we knew that it was about doing more for our employees, having better infrastructures as employers, and connecting with our community. There was work to do, that we needed to support each other in order to make to kind of raise the bar, so to speak. So the Community Kitchen is a program that came about in some of these conversations. In 2020, as the pandemic hit, what shifted is, instead of kind of this bigger, broader scope of all these things that we wanted to do as an organization to help other small businesses, the focus ended up going around guidance, providing guidance and resources for fellow independent business owners. Most of the leadership team within Good Work Austin pre-pandemic were of the restaurant scene, were small independent restaurant owners or in the food service space. There were other members as well, but that's kind of who stuck around. So in May of 2020, we created a reopening guideline to help restaurants understand the landscape of what we were dealing with. So we created an internal guidelines because we couldn't understand and keep up with the local, state, and federal constantly changing guidelines. So we created an opening guidelines to help us have something to gravitate to and hold on to. And that sort of brought more business owners into our conversation. The community kitchen was a result, to put it bluntly, it wasn't as much of this program that we were envisioning to create. It was an emergency relief project. That's ultimately what it was. And it really is that even today, but we have these ideas of values that we want to instill in hopes of this becoming more. But ultimately, there was food access needs in our communities. There were business owners that needed to sustain that ultimately prepare food. So it was integrating these resources that were not connecting. It seems like they should connect, but as Max, as you referenced, there's these pre-existing sort of structures that exist, especially in government systems when it comes to relief, that tend to go more directly to traditional sources and supplies. So food access projects, other than food banks, traditionally would just go to a corporation or a pre-existing supplier or qualified supplier within these request for proposal flows that exist within our within city, state, county systems, and also in nonprofit and profit organizations. And so what we did was just essentially kind of had to push for just changing that landscape, changing how the source for food could stay more local. So we now have a group of about 15 to 18 restaurants that are involved in prepared meals that service food insecure individuals and communities within and around Austin. And we do this by working with city and county programs that are facilitating and helping fund access to prepared meals for individuals facing homelessness. We have a partnership with AISD for a caregiver meals program. So we're preparing finished meals. And I'm going to touch on a little bit more about the food part of it after I speak a little bit about the structure of how everyone's coming together. Other initiatives are the EVE initiative that's helping us send prepared meals to food pantries. And then we have a program that's in partnership with other organizations that are helping us serve through a Safe Table program that's serving prepared meals to seniors within our communities. So we're hitting all these individuals of different calibers, but all that have that need of food insecurity. And it kind of goes right back into the scope of, I missed that one, because you did touch on the fact that the service industry is also seeing loss of work. So we also have one program that is providing meals for restaurant workers who lost their jobs and are still kind of in that new landscape now of having this need of food insecurities. So it crosses all race, all people, all age. This is all around our communities in every neighborhood. The statistics have been showing that over the last year, that it was, food insecurities were a little bit more traditionally very focused, and now they're even more focused in those same areas. But now it's sprinkled all around our city. It's in every neighborhood. So the community kitchen it's allowing independent restaurants to facilitate this network of food access. The other part of this is that through Good Work Austin, instead of us being a corporation that just is funneling food in like a massive amount, we're distributing it through multiple locations, multiple businesses, giving them a revenue generation and helping them maintain staff and maintain their employees, but also doing it at a slightly different level. We're requiring that all of the community kitchen participants pay a higher fair minimum wage of $15 an hour. We're requiring that they source at least 50% of their ingredients from local farms and sources, and also using environmentally friendly wares. So there's not only the network that's happening with changing the landscape of how food is procured and prepared and shared, we're also raising the bar and how internally it's being done. So I'm going to pause there, and then if there's time, I can touch a little bit about on the food itself and where we want to see it grow now that we're in this phase of acting as food response, an emergency response, what could come of this is something that we could share on if we have some time later.
Thank you so much, Aswini. I love how interconnected this project is, supporting local growers, local restaurants, really managing or leveling up kind of the living wage, taking advantage of city and government resources. So I'm really inspired by this. And yeah, I hope we can get to some questions at the end. At this point, I want to invite Roberto Araiza into the conversation to talk a little bit about Urban Roots and his experience there. Roberto is a current student at Texas State. He's a psychology major, has a minor in social work. He started, I met him when he was volunteering in high school. He was just volunteering at the Urban Roots farm. Then he became a farm intern with us and became a leader as an assistant crew leader. So he's has had many seasons at the Urban Roots farm. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Urban Roots got started just for a couple of minutes, and then I want to invite Roberto to talk about Urban Roots overall and share about his experience. Urban Roots touches on a few elements of food justice. Originally, we were a program of a youth organization called Youth Launch, and we were doing after-school gardening at some middle schools, and essentially using the garden as an opportunity to learn about social and emotional learning and how to give back to the community by growing food. The school garden is a great model. We weren't able to grow as much food for the community because we just had a few garden beds. And so I kind of pitched to the board and the organization, if we really want to have sustainable agriculture to be a tool for young people to learn about themselves and giving back to the community, I think we need to go bigger. So we researched best practices around the country, primarily from the Food Project up in Boston. We had a community meeting with farmers, educators, hunger relief advocates to kind of get a sense for, is Austin ready for this? And who wants to be involved? And that was kind of the beginning of our Community Advisory Council. And then most importantly, we did focus groups with over 120 young people from all East Austin public schools to see, is this even interesting to you? Would you want to be a part of this? What would the logistics need to be like? What would the curriculum need to be like? And because Urban Roots is paid, we would want to make sure that the stipend would be enough that it would value and honor their work and efforts. And so what that did is bringing so many people together at the very beginning allowed us to create a shared ownership over the project. And as it became alive, we had a lot of people that were excited to promote us as we were getting the project off the ground. So at this point, I want to bring Roberto in. Roberto, how's it going?
Pretty good. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. Thank you for having me. And also, first and foremost, I just want to, I want to hope that everyone is staying warm and staying healthy right now. But just to touch on Urban Roots for just a second, Max already touched on a lot of the important points. It is a farm, but to me, in reality, it's quite a bit more than that. It's where kids are able to learn for the very first time what hard manual agricultural work actually means. And then it's also a place where they can learn to grow into being a leader, often for the very first time. But most importantly, I think, as it kind of pertains to this impact hour, it's where kids are able to learn what food inequity means. And then later on, kind of how to become an actual advocate for food justice, which is what I consider to be doing right now as I'm here studying psychology and social work. So I worked at Urban Roots starting back in 2013, about 8 years ago now, which is hard to believe. But it served as my very first job. And it's also the first place where I heard the term food justice. I had never heard that term before. So kind of in that way, that job also provided me with kind of a privilege check. Just as an example, at that age, I was only about 16 years old at the time. I had never really thought about, what it means to have a grocery store nearby. I live in San Marcos right now. I have an HEB about 5 minutes away. And going back to Urban Roots, I'm thankful every day to a degree to have an HEB so close to me, because that job was what first taught me how much of a luxury that is. And that's a part of food justice. That job really gave me a greater appreciation of food in general, specifically healthy food. And especially since many farm workers right now are only being paid cents on the dollar for essentially that same work, and a lot more of that work than what we were doing at Urban Roots. So in a lot of ways, that job and learning about those inequities, it's what inspired me to go into social work and to go into psychology. And it's going to be a continuing motivating factor and inspirational factor moving forward in my career. And I hope I can be a part of the solution.
Thanks, Roberto. I love hearing you talk about your experience. It's always super inspiring for me. And I think we've learned a lot about Urban Roots since we started. It got started in 2008. And we were a program of another organization for the first 4 years, and then we became our own nonprofit in 2011. And so, we started, and I think it still is, primarily a youth organization and with the focus of social emotional learning. But I think in the last few years, it's really evolved to be much more community responsive. Actually, Urban Roots in the last, year or so, recently signed a lease with the city of Austin to have a second farm location in Southeast Austin in Dove Springs, which we're really excited about. We started working with residents to assess their interest and support about 4 years ago, and it took a while to go through city council to finally get a lease from the city. And I think that shift is going to really allow the organization to evolve in a really exciting way. I think another thing when I think of like lessons learned was I think about the organizational structure. We're kind of getting into meso work here, thinking about governance and how you start an organization from the very beginning has a lasting impact on agency culture, and I think ultimately on impact, long-term impact for the clients. When I think of a lot of nonprofits, I think of its governance. It kind of mirrors and mimics the corporate hierarchy. So you have a board of directors. A lot of this is designated by the Secretary of State, but it typically has hierarchic leadership and decision making. And there is different ranges of accountability to the communities that they're serving. I mean, as mentioned, I'm on the board of the New Philanthropists, which is really working to increase racial diversity on nonprofit boards, which is incredibly important to have representation to make sure that the communities that are being served well. And I acknowledge my own privilege as a white heterosexual male, cisgendered male. And that Urban Roots was created by two white men. Those were the co-founders, not from Austin. And Urban Roots would look very different if it was created from other folks. And so thinking about if I was going to start a different type of project, I would really look for the ways to be more collaborative. Recently, I've been really inspired by this model called a worker self-directed nonprofit, which essentially combines a worker cooperative with a 501c3. Some really interesting work done by the Sustainable Economies Law Center out in Oakland that is trying to really democratize nonprofits to be much more accountable. I'm also really inspired by this great book, Emergent Strategy. I don't know if y'all can see that. Very, very cool book written by Adrienne Marie Browns, looking at nature and how we can organize and create movements that look at some of the principles around nature that honor more diversity, accountability, and collaboration. And as we think about looking ahead to ecotherapy, we want to get a little ecotherapy in here. I would really ask folks to refer back to Starla Simmons, Professor Simmons, a presentation that she did for EJET last fall. I learned a ton. And I can say that personally, I gained a lot, and I feel like by working on farms, and I feel like my farm experience personally and what I've witnessed, I see that land can be a therapeutic environment, and I see that Urban Roots was a refuge for a lot of young people. But I think, again, it's important to acknowledge that not everybody feels comfortable being outside, and not everybody feels comfortable being on farms. And, these systems of oppression, of slavery, capitalism, white supremacy, have really harmed people's relationship with land. And I do believe, and that contributes to intergenerational trauma with land, and with farming too. I do believe, and this is a privileged position to say this, that with a supportive environment, diverse mentors and role models, that you can create a safe and welcoming and inclusive space, and that farms and the environment can be a healing space. But it does take a lot of intentionality and support for the outdoors to be that healing place for others. And as I kind of dream about what an ecotherapy project for me could be, I'm currently working to get my clinical social work license. I left Urban Roots last summer. And as I think about what a collaborative project could look like, I'm really interested in co-collaboration, and what I've learned with Urban Roots. I really want to be thoughtful and reflective, that I can find some other folks that can, share some values, but also we could create some governance and shared leadership that kind of mimics the audience that we're trying to engage as well. So the last slide, I think, is more of just a point of examples. I'm really inspired by a lot. This is just a very small sample. Those folks up top, there's the project in Virginia. It's really inspiring. Silvanaqua Soulfire Farm is a powerful organization up in New York, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, like I mentioned before. La Via Campesina is an international project. I think the city of Austin is doing some interesting work with Good Food Purchasing Program, buying food from local farmers to distribute through AISD. And that's a huge position of equity, supporting growers and making sure that good local food gets to those who need it. And then these are really small grassroots food justice projects: Austin Mutual Aid, ATX Free Fridge Project, Red Beans Austin. All those, if you do a search on Instagram even, and you can find a lot of information from all these folks. And then Sustainable Food Center has been here for a long time, and Farm Share Austin has been as well. At this point, I'd love to kick it over for the Q&A, and bring back Sweeney and bring Roberto back in to the conversation, and see what folks are interested in digging into for the rest of our time together.
Thank you so much, Max. We did have one question that came in prior to the event today. And the question was, what impacts can social workers have on providing food justice in Texas as it pertains to school-age children?
I think that there's a lot of advocacy to be done around getting better food into the school systems. The slide before that talked about where the city of Austin is collaborating with AISD to really get local food in, and that's really because of Annalise Tanner is an incredible advocate within the school system and school district to really get creative. To be honest, like, that is the largest distributor of food to young people. They're serving 70,000, would it say, like 250,000 meals last summer, or 750 last summer. They're distributing so much food to those in need. So how do we advocate to get resources to those school districts? I think the federal match for food reimbursement can only do so much. I think the hard part, when you think of what the school district can do, the school district is also competing against a lot of other influences. They're competing against charter schools. When you think about the reimbursement for those meals, the meal reimbursements from the federal government is based on attendance and enrollment. And so as local school districts lose students to charter schools, they also lose their ability to be that huge vehicle for food distribution. Another big thing that has been shown to be really, really effective is breakfast at schools. And I think that we really need to advocate for breakfast at schools in classrooms, because sometimes there can be a stigma around if not everybody's going to get breakfast before school, then maybe it's not for everybody. And so how do you have not only have the food, but distribute it in a way that feels equitable and that there's no stigma. And then finding ways to send food home with students on the weekends and during holidays. I just think that we're working, the school can be such a powerful resource. And there's so many social workers that are working at schools, advocating around schools, working with school districts. That'd be where I'd like to advocate for folks to get involved.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions from the audience now. You can either just unmute yourself or use the chat.
I actually had a question, if possible. And this came up, I guess, listening to Sweeney's speaking. I'm wondering if there's a tension when trying to advocate for food justice with environmental justice, because what I'm thinking is if you make it your mission to increase food access as much as possible, the easiest way to do that is to go for the least expensive food. And in that sense, there could be kind of a way of compromising with the sourcing that you're receiving. Kind of the more you're able to provide food, maybe the harder it is to be fully ethical with how you are providing that food. And I'm wondering if you find it is possible to be fully ethical in both ends, or if there is that tension between providing food and making it local sustainable.
You bring up a good question. And if I'm understanding it correctly, just kind of like, how do you scale sort of to maintain the integrity? Is that kind of what you're asking? How do you continue to manage the growing need?
Yes, exactly. While not, because in my mind, it would be so easy to compromise and say, we're going to use the cheapest sources that can just produce a whole lot.
Yeah, it's one of the difficult conversations we're having within the scope of the meal programs. To touch on it, the meal programs that are funded right now they're a low dollar value. And in fact, one of the difficulties, Max kind of touched on this too, is because of not putting enough value to nutrients and good food in these government systems, we're not able to, or traditionally the quality of food and thus the lack of nutrients that we're providing in food or has been provided in like through food banks and pantries, et cetera, are of low quality, which do not help the scope. The margins are tight, the costs are high in order to source locally. However, the sort of the benefit that we're trying to look at is sustainability. We're not looking at a structure this isn't like a profit system. You need profit to sustain, but this isn't like a system for a trajectory where the entities involved are doing this because we're on a increasing trajectory for profit. It's sustaining the community, sustaining the businesses, keeping people employed, but doing as much as we can to have the nutrient content in there, right? So sourcing locally, for example, most of the local sources are produce. And that's a good thing because we need to be consuming more produce in order to get the nutrient level that we need instead of like sugar-based processed foods. So one way of sort of battling this question that you're bringing up is a distributed network. So if you traditionally go to a larger business, a larger corporation, the sourcing channels are going to go to one large entity to a large farm versus smaller entities, smaller restaurants, just as an example, are already used to sourcing on a local level in a smaller scale. So we're using a more like distributed system that helps alleviate, and not in an easy way, but it helps sort of in that vein of making it possible to scale, to offer more better food, and also to be very mindful of what's going in it. It is a hard situation. I'm going to add one more thing. We bid for a city contract, and the numbers were so low. So it is about changing how people and changing how our government policies think about food and what we're feeding people.
Yep, I think that's really smart. I'd love to jump to, I know we have a couple more minutes, to Emma's question, what actions should we advocate the Biden administration, the USDA take in regards to agricultural equity? That's a great question. I think that that article in the New York Times really spoke to this too, because it's talking about climate change as well as equity. I think investing in farmers of color, creating more opportunities, access to land, access to resources, thinking about carbon sequestration through sustainable agriculture. So creating more investment in organic and sustainable agricultural farming practices as well. And I think that also, you know, the USDA is huge in that it oversees agricultural policy. It also oversees SNAP, which is probably the largest program. And there's another program that they oversee called the Community Food Projects Grant, which is nationally looking at food justice projects. So finding ways that more money, more resources toward community food projects, and that gives more local communities opportunities to create their own projects from scratch. That would be really important and huge. Yeah, those are just a few small things that I would say.
I did want to throw in there, I'm sorry, I did want to just throw in there that one of our alumni, Jessica, that I can't remember her last name, she actually wrote the SNAP program many years ago, and she still works for the Department of Agriculture. And so she's always loves to talk to students, and I could definitely remember her last name and connect you with her if anybody's interested. Did we have one other question or comment?
I don't think
No.
so.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. We're right at the top of the hour, and I want to thank our guests and our students for putting this together. Max, thank you so much for finding Asarwai and Roberto. Roberto, I think you should get your master's in social work.
I agree.
All right. Yes. I know.
Especially join our ecotherapy collective once you get out of school and become an LCSW. And my very first job, Roberto, you remind me of myself, when I was 15, Austin Interfaith, Sustainable Food Center. You know, it's hard work. And you have to definitely appreciate all the layers you guys talked about. Thank you. So good today. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you all so much, and have a good day. Stay warm.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Christina. Good to see you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Max.